What even is the mythical reality? Surely myths are things that just aren't even real. Or if we value them at all, we might see them as just symbols and archetypes that mirror our psyche. Well, in this episode with shamanic teacher and author Chris Lüttichau, we explore that question. What is the mythical reality? How can shamanism help create a bridge for us to enter it? And what are the gifts and benefits of doing so? I think you are going to love this episode, particularly if you've only ever related to myths from that place of being more like an archetypal framework. And again, not to make that wrong at all. I love that too. And yet, in this episode, we're talking about something quite different. Let's dive in. Hello, Chris. A warm welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. And we did I don't know if it was 3 episodes a year or two ago, where we focused on different, I guess, aspects within shamanism. And I'm really looking forward to today's conversation where we are going to be kind of weaving together the kind of two seemingly dichotomous topics of shamanism and also working with myths and archetypes if in a way that I think those of us in the West with a kind of more modern view, psychological view, let's say, can also be looking at these things through. So I think I'm really excited about this conversation because it was just occurring to me that's so interesting given the two areas of work that are very dear to my heart, something that I'm thinking about and working with all the time. And yet I wrote a post about this very sort of dichotomy this week, but I don't think it's something that I've ever spoken directly about on the show, either on my own or with anyone. So I think this is going to be really juicy. Let's begin with your own journey, your own story around mythology. Like, what does that mean to you? How have you personally related to, benefited from mythology and archetypes?
Well, I grew up in Denmark, and there we learned from a very early age about mythology from both the Vikings, but also from Inuits from Greenland. And that was
Yes.
always something that we focused on quite a bit in the early days in school. And I remember that it made an impact on me, and it was a world that, as a child, you could relate to directly, so to say, without analyzing it. So those stories, when they are told to a child, the child doesn't go into a theoretical analysis of the myth, but it's like the child will kind of live within the myth and in the imagination. So I think that's how mythology began for me. Was those stories from the Vikings and also from the Inuits, and I'm still working with myth in the sense that I remember certain myth and I make a point of remembering them in details, and I contemplate them, and it's like they speak to me on a deeper and deeper level, meaning that I expand my understanding of them. It's like they reveal new things to me on an ongoing basis.
I love that. And yes, of course, what a rich storytelling heritage you come from. I can have a little bit kind of fairy folktale envy, actually. I mean, of course, there's so many rich myths, legends, and folktales of the British land too. But yeah, there's definitely something very enticing about the Norse and Inuit tales. Yeah, I can really feel how that must have really come alive for you as a child. Like you say, there's a way of entering and journeying with stories that is anything but analytical, is really kind of like dreaming with, being dreamed by the stories, which really is, feels quite akin to a shamanic lens in itself. I think that it takes us back to perhaps our roots, really, that is how we related, told, lived into stories.
Yeah, and I would say that myth play a major role in shamanism in general. And in the Western world, in the modern world, when the word myth is mentioned, there's an implication that it's not factual, that it's not really true, and that it's more in the realm of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So that you could say that's how the word myth has developed in the West. That we put it in that kind of category where if you go to shamanic cultures, the myths there are seen in a very different way. In that they are seen to reveal truth on a deeper level. Also teach people about the secrets of life, and also you could say another purpose of myth from a shamanic perspective is to teach us how to live, teach us to deepen our understanding of ourselves, but also of the universe. And you could say also that there are different kinds, categories of myth. So there are myths about tricksters. There are myth about creation, and also a lot of myth about the stars and the people from the stars. So when those myths are told in traditional shamanic cultures, they are repeated again and again and again, and so they have a very kind of formative effect on the people shamanically, and where you could say that a real difference between what you were talking about with the Western way of understanding and then the traditional shamanic way of understanding is that in the Western world we live in a kind of theoretical reality where there's a lot of emphasis on rational thinking and logic and basically the mind in general is in focus, where that is not really the case in shamanism, where in shamanism you have a ceremonial context around the myth, and they are not, so to say, interesting stories, but when for example, an elder tells a myth, then the way the elder is speaking brings the people who are listening into a ceremonial space where they actually are able to enter in and connect into the time when where that myth comes from. And so you could say that in the West we live in a linear time concept where we have the past and we have the present and we have the future, where from a shamanic perspective, there's a different way of viewing and experiencing time, which is circular time, where you can say you learn about the circular time by watching nature, and that could include watching the seasons, so spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And in that way, time is experienced in a different way. So when a myth is told traditionally in a shamanic culture, it is a magic thing that's happening, because it opens a portal for the listeners who are listening from the heart rather than from the mind, to enter into that mythic time from and connect into the time where those people who are described in the myth, they live. So you could say that the myth creates a bridge between the present moment and the here and the now, and then the mythic time. And so, for example, there are myths about the first shamans, and the Buried tribe in Siberia. They have this myth, like many cultures have, about a golden age where everything was in a harmonious state, and the animals and humans could understand each other, talk the same language, and even shapeshift from one to the other. And then things began to go wrong, in the sense that the illness started coming into the realm of the human beings. And then in that myth from Siberia, then an eagle shaman came down from the Pleiades to help the humans. And when such a myth is told, the people can connect directly with that mythical time where the first shaman came. And so also when the shaman is doing, for example, a healing session, the shaman can access the power and connect with the power of that first eagle shaman that came from the stars. So the way I perceive it is that in the West, we because we tend to understand and view a myth from a logical and mind-based perspective, we maybe don't understand the depth of the magic that a myth can provide, and traditionally do provide and have provided for tribal shamanic people. And there is also this understanding shamanically that the myth, they are messages brought to us from the ancestors, but originally many of the myths are seen to come from supernatural beings that have brought the myth to the people through dreams, through visions. And so the myths are seen to be sacred and magical, and they can bring us into a mythical time where we are entering an altered state of consciousness and a heightened awareness. And so in shamanic cultures traditionally, there are a lot of reminders of that mythical time. And those reminders would be the songs, the ceremonies, but also the way they put symbols on the artifacts and on their clothing, and on the drums and so forth. So those symbols are also ways to connect to the myth and to that mythical time. And that is a circular time, that's cyclical time, where you actually have access to what we will call the past, but they don't see it that way shamanically, because the past and the future and the now are all one, and the myth gives the myth will give access to that reality, so to say, and to that expanded way of experiencing, where we in the West will perceive the myth, maybe the figures in the myth as archetypes that are reflections of aspects of ourselves. Where in
If I can just come in there, because
yeah,
there's something before we move into that. There's something I would love to share that was brought through from what you were saying, and I love this, and I think we can feel this. This is what was occurring to me. You know how looked at through a more ancient, mythic, animistic lens, the stories are, you know, they have magic in themselves. They are magic, they are portals to magic, and we can experience that. And it took me back to a ceremony a couple of years ago led by some indigenous Mexican shamans from the Wirakuta, and it's a peyote ceremony. But what stood out to me both during the ceremony, it's just come up again in this conversation, was as part of the ceremony, it's traditional for one of the shamans to sing, but the song is obviously in a language I don't understand consciously, but the song, from what I understand, is about the sun, it is about the peyote, it is about the sacred deer and the fire. And even without knowing the words of the song and what they meant, it absolutely was this portal, certainly for me, but I suspect for many others in the ceremony, to be transported into this like deep time, um, deep mythic experience beyond any sorts of, and in some ways, because I didn't know the names of those symbols, you know, it wasn't like when he was speaking out the word for sun, I knew he was saying the word for sun, for example, and yet that opening into the experience was still present. And in fact, again, because my rational Western mind wasn't able to kind of like grasp onto the symbols, perhaps it was even more powerful.
yes, and that also has to do with that. In shamanism, when a myth is told, if it is told by somebody who is really tuned in to the myth and not as a kind of interesting story, then it is basically seen that when the myth is being told, the spirits come in. So that's the ceremonial aspects of storytelling, and specifically in relation to myth, is that the spirits come in, and then magic can happen, and they
It's
can.
an invocation as much as it's a story or a song, isn't it? It's like that's part of the nature of it.
Yes, and the spirits can help to bring the audience into that time. For example, when the first shaman came to help the people. So it is a very different way to relate to myth in shamanism, and it has a lot to do with learning through the myth to live in harmony with all of life, and also a lot to do with understanding who we are as individuals and also collectively, and the myth are ways to go deeper and deeper into in that understanding, and that's why the myth are repeated again and again and again, because they, you can say, they traditionally form or contribute to form the identity of a people.
Yes. Yeah. So now coming back to where you were just about to take it, which is kind of the crux of this episode. As you were saying, through that kind of Western modern mind, we can either relate to myths as being just complete, irrelevant nonsense that, is something completely made up and has no purpose whatsoever. Then there's another view, which is looking at myths and archetypes and folktales through the lens of these are rich, universal archetypes and symbols that when we are able to make contact with them and relate to them, they can be these kind of mirrors and lenses and doorways into understanding ourselves and our psyche. And in that, the very notion of that is interesting to me, that through a kind of more shamanic animistic lens, there's a very relational, it's about being in relationship with all of the other beings that are here present in, again, when we're looking at it from a deep time perspective, are always present. Whereas the way of relating to stories through this kind of much more, these are lenses on my own psyche, that is really in service of something different. This is in service of individuation, becoming whole as a person. And to my mind, and this is not to say this is right, this is just my own kind of calling and my own sense on things, is that they both have a place. They both have a purpose. I think there is a deep call right now for us to reclaim and rebirth that animistic way of being in relationship to ourselves and others, including non-human others. And I think there is a call to become whole, to individuate again, which is a Jungian lens, but I think there is there's a much more kind of ancient alchemical heritage of that. And so it's not for me that necessarily that more modern Western lens on it is wrong or doesn't have a place. For me, it absolutely does. And yet it brings us back to this sort of dichotomy where it's like, there's a tension between those two things. Because if we are, it's like, so I'd love to hear, first of all, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with why indigenous people and then Western kind of European-based people have had such difficulties understanding each other. Because the Westerners come from that mind-based and analytical way where, like you say, it has its place and it can be very useful also and helpful in understanding oneself. But where the shamanic view is that the myth are ways to enter a magic space and enter that mythical time and go into a ceremony, basically, where you then let the characters that are in the myth and the events in the myth work directly on you. So you are there in the myth. You are not separate from it. You don't look at it from the outside. You are within the myth, and you are partaking while the storyteller is speaking. And so it's simply, as I see it, two very different approaches, and both have value. And obviously, we in the West, we work with the things we have access to, where I think also that the interest in the Western world in shamanism that has grown tremendously over the last year, the last decades, it's also an expression of a need to connect with that more magical realm of myth. And you could say that it's the one approach is maybe psychological, the Western, with analysis and seeing the characters as archetypes on the one hand, and then seeing the story as a spiritual, magical, transformative, ceremonial space, so to say. And I think in what's happening now in the Western world is that shamanism has that role now, that it brings in that spiritual way of relating to myth, that more ceremonial and magical way of relating to myth and experiencing the myth directly. So there's a hunger in us in the Western world, because that is something that has been missing for a long time, and that's why the word myth, like we talked about in the beginning, often means something that's not real and a fantasy and so forth. So it really is the difference between relating from, on the one hand, the mind, and on the other hand, the spirit and the heart.
Yes, really, really beautifully captured. And I think that actually puts nicely why, and again, not for everyone, but I think for some of us, this can be a worthwhile consideration, as in, if we are, again, I think those of us in that kind of modern Western mind, like our minds are very active. We're used to using our minds in that way, in that very analytical, rational way. And for most, that isn't something we can just turn off. It isn't something that even necessarily is going to be most serving for us to do. And so I think if there is a way that we can kind of be in this dance where, as you say, there is this real call back to living from the heart and experiencing life from the heart in a way that makes no sense to the mind, and we can absolutely use our minds in ways that are serving, which I think again brings us back to, like, there is this juxtaposition between these two views, and there is again, I think, a call for, again, not all of us, but let's assume people listening to the show do have a call to kind of be in this dance between these two seemingly at odds way of viewing the world, where we can both enter a story as something absolutely real and alive and immersive and being lived through us, and we can somehow, maybe not simultaneously at the same time, maybe that happens kind of afterwards, also look at those symbols and, oh, what's this showing me about me? Where is this telling me that I need to sort of attend to some healing here, or whatever it might be calling us? And so for me, this is part of what we are being called to, where it's not about just dismissing the mind, but it's like, how do we allow these two things to weave together?
Yeah, and an example of that would be the trickster myth. For example, from the Vikings, we have Loki. The Native Americans, they have coyote, and in some tribes, the raven, and the other tribes, I think it's maybe the rabbit. And those trickster figures are universal forces. They are the powers in the universe that trick us into learning the kind of things that we resist learning. And they are the kind of sometimes what appear as destructive forces that create a change that actually was necessary, and forces us as human beings to take the next step in our evolution, and they force us to learn certain lessons that we would resist. And like you say, those trickster figures can also then be perceived as aspects of the self. And that would probably be the case both in the kind of Western approach to archetypes, but also in the shamanic understanding. There is this seeing that the story is revealing something about ourselves, but also something about the powers of creation and the powers that rule the cosmos. And in that way, the myth educate us and help us to understand something about how to live in this world here. And the myth can also, and they definitely have that in shamanic cultures, be sources of strength. So people will gain strength from the myth. The myth can give them hope. They give them maybe a sense of pride and resilience and endurance. And they will tell the people something about where they can access the strength to live in a good way within themselves. And in the Celtic world, you could say that the Arthurian myth, they are traditionally, originally meant to have that kind of play that kind of role, that you can take strength from them, and they keep you strong when you are experiencing difficulties in your life, and they help you build resilience. And there's a lot of myth of that kind of character. For example, I took a group of people to Mongolia a few years ago, and we hiked across the steppes there, and we also went to the capital, Ulaanbaatar, and everywhere we went, there were images of Genghis Khan. We were constantly reminded of him. So he has become a mythical figure that the Mongolian people are constantly drawing strength from. And it gives them this sense of pride and identity and a strong heart and so forth. So the myth can work on many levels. And like you say, they can educate us about aspects of the self, like in a more analytical way. So, so how do you awaken that power of Genghis Khan to overcome any obstacle within yourself? So the myth are kind of reminders of, yes, we have that possibility. We have that kind of power available.
I love that so much. The when you mentioned the trickster at the beginning there, I was recalling something that my past shamanic teacher, Jez Hughes, talked about, which is the indigenous Mexican community I mentioned. Within a group of, they're called Murakami, but shamans in the way that we would understand their role. And within a group of Murakami that would serve that particular community, there would be one who would inhabit, like commit to playing the role of the trickster for a period of time, quite a long period of time, actually, if I recall rightly, like years. And that person's role was to break the taboos. It was, in a ceremony, to actually cause chaos, to, be drunk, to make fun of people, to, do all the things that were seen as taboos. But there's actually a role for that person to inhabit and act those things out. And I was thinking when you were saying that, I was like, so interesting in that it's seen as a role that, needs to be consciously included in the community, not banished, which is very similar to what we're talking about in terms of when we relate to these things as aspects of all of us. These are, these are roles, traits, that are going to show up in a community, but also within our own psyche. There is something really interesting in that, like such deep wisdom of let's actually consciously make a space for the trickster to be one of us. There's something so clever about that, isn't there?
Mm. Yes, and that is something you will find in a lot of shamanic cultures in North America. On the Plain Indians, I think they have a figure called the Heyoka, which is also somebody who takes on the role to do all the things you normally wouldn't do, and walk backwards and sit backwards on a horse and so forth, to remind us of why we do things the way we do them, and
Mm,
turn everything upside down so we don't get stuck in the old habits. So they keep the community healthy by
mm,
questioning the habits. And when it's time to let go of an old habit that has been outlived, they are a force that help the people to see that we need maybe to drop something that we have done for a long time that has been outdated. And there, of course, there are also myths that prepare us for death.
mm,
So when that contrary is doing things that we normally wouldn't do, they can also help people to look at their own death and their own mortality and prepare for that. And globally, universally, there are loads of myths that talk about what happens after death, that you go on this journey and maybe there are obstacles and maybe there are monsters you need to face. And if you pass through the tests, in many of the myths, you arrive at a river where there's a guardian. And
mm,
the guardian is very often a black dog, and sometimes it can also be other creatures. But there is a guardian, and then you are or are not allowed to cross the river, and then you are basically in the realm of the dead. And so the myth can also have that role, basically, of preparing us for the afterworld.
mm,
And that, of course, puts people who have that kind of myth and who live according to that kind of myth on high ground, because those myths then help people to not be afraid of death, and furthermore, to actually be prepared for the day when when the death comes, and to be able to die with grace. So the
mm,
myth can have, like you say, with the contraries, they can have that function, keep the community healthy. They can have the function also of living in a good way and being ready to die in a good way when that day comes. And
mm,
then it has to do also with that, if those myths had come into the psyche already from childhood, and in some tribes there's that habit of some elders walking around very early in the morning, walking around in the camp and telling certain myths. So that is the first you hear when you are in that state between waking and sleeping and waking.
mm,
So it goes, the message goes directly into a very deep level of the psyche, and then that myth become maybe one of the most powerful formative forces in the life of such a human being, and throughout adulthood they will constantly go back to those lessons there and then live accordingly, as a compass, have those myths as a compass. So in that way, in shamanism, myths are hugely important, because they basically guide people how to live in a way that has been given to the people from spiritual beings, supernatural beings, from what we would call maybe great teachers that have maybe visited people in their dreams, in visions, or from even from great teachers that have walked the earth and brought these teachings about how to live in a way of harmony.
Mm. Oh my goodness, this this is one of those conversations I'd quite happily be in for the rest of the day, but we are coming off on time. For people listening, and my sense is people listening may be coming more from a shamanic lens, or they might be coming more from a kind of psychological, archetypal, hermetic lens. And so my hope is there's something in it for people coming from either place. What's your sense as to what would be an invitation, a way of orientating that could invite people more deeply into this very rich way of journeying with myths that isn't kind of demanding that we either relate to it as something alive and living through us, or only from an archetypal, symbolic lens? What would you say would be a helpful way for that to kind of just unfold in a way that, again, more and more I see as like, really, this is our birthright. The technology is actually like built right into the stories, into our blood and bones. And this is a kind of like, we're having to sort of cobble it together in this modern world because we've been bereft of that. But how can we live back into that way of being? Another way of putting it really simply, using the title of the podcast, like, how can we be mythical?
Yeah, good point. I think first thing is that myths are using the language of the soul. They don't speak in the language of the mind. They speak in symbols. They speak in images. They speak in poetry. So that is similar to a dream. So when you have a dream, that dream also generally speaks in that kind of soul language, poetry and images and symbols. So to approach myth from that perspective, that they can be looked at in the similar way that you would look at a dream, so that they give you information that speaks directly to your heart and your soul. So to enter the myth, listening to the myth, contemplating the myth with an open heart, basically, and let the symbols speak directly to your heart and feel. So I would say it's a matter of feeling rather than thinking, and it's a matter of using your intuition, that little whisper that comes from deep within, rather than the much louder voice of the mind. So to be tuned into the heart, to be tuned into the intuition, that means then the myth will begin to speak to you directly and inform you directly, and that's where the magic is, and then you are you're touching into this mythical time and mythical reality. And still, that can be done as a Westerner who lives in the modern world, and you basically just build a bridge into that reality of myth.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. I feel like I don't need or want to add anything to that. Like what a rich invitation. Who wouldn't want to build that bridge? So where can listeners find out more about you and the wonderful work you do?
Well, I have a website called northerndrum.com, where my workshops are listed, and also my expeditions into Lapland and other places, like I mentioned, Mongolia. I've written a book called Calling Us Home that is also about shamanism and like what you have brought forward here, like bringing shamanism up to date in the modern world, so it's something we can relate to as Westerners in the modern world, and that book is very much about that. I've written another book called Spirit Animal Guides. So those are ways if people want to find out more.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Chris. This has been such a pleasure. Really, again, I'm so glad that that notion of like let's really go like right into the heart of like myth and shamanism. Yeah, what a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's been great talking to you.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.